April 30, 1945. Berlin is quiet in a way it has never been before. Above ground, the city is broken. Buildings stand hollow, streets buried under rubble, smoke drifting without direction. Artillery has stopped, not because the fighting is over, but because there is almost nothing left to fight for. Below ground, beneath layers of concrete and steel, Adolf Hitler sits in a dimly lit bunker. The air is heavy. Maps that once promised victory now show nothing but collapse. The Reich that was meant to last 1,000 years has survived barely 12. Outside this room, millions are dead. Entire nations are scarred. And yet for years, the world believed a simple story, that World War II was driven by a single madman, blindly dragging Europe into ruin. The truth is far more unsettling. Hitler did not stumble into war unaware. He was not always reckless. Many of his most dangerous decisions were calculated, deliberate, and, for a time, terrifyingly effective. To understand how the world reached this moment, underground in Berlin, we must strip away myth, propaganda, and hindsight. This is World War II Hitler, not as a caricature, but as history actually unfolded. And it begins long before the war ever started. In the years after the First World War, Germany was a nation suspended between humiliation and fear. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped it of territory, military strength, and economic stability. Reparations drained the economy. Inflation destroyed savings. Veterans returned to a country that no longer recognized their sacrifice. The sense of injustice was not abstract, it was daily, visible, and personal. By the early 1920s, political violence had become routine. Street battles between rival groups were common. Democratic institutions existed, but trust in them was thin. Many Germans did not see the Republic as legitimate. They saw it as imposed, weak, and incapable of restoring dignity. It was in this environment that Adolf Hitler emerged, not as a general or strategist, but as a political agitator. His power did not come from military genius at first. It came from language. He spoke to resentment, to loss, and to the belief that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated. His message was simple, repeated relentlessly. Germany had enemies within and without, and only unity under strong leadership could save it. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the fragile system collapsed further. Unemployment soared into the millions. Banks failed. The promise of stability vanished almost overnight. Extremism thrived where desperation lived. The Nazi Party did not seize power through force alone. It exploited crisis, legality, and political paralysis. By January 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. He did not yet control Germany completely, but he understood something crucial. Power, once gained, must be consolidated quickly. Within months, opposition parties were suppressed. Independent institutions were neutralized. Loyalty to the state was replaced with loyalty to the leader. Yet even at this stage, Hitler's vision of war was not reckless in appearance. His early actions focused on rebuilding strength quietly. Germany withdrew from international constraints. Rearmament began in violation of treaties, but cautiously. Factories expanded. Conscription returned. The army grew, not for immediate conflict, but for future leverage. Crucially, these moves went largely unchallenged. Britain and France, still traumatized by the slaughter of World War I, prioritized stability over confrontation. Appeasement was not cowardice in their minds, it was survival. Each violation of the post-war order was treated as a manageable risk. Each concession was seen as buying time. Hitler interpreted this restraint differently. To him, it confirmed a belief. His opponents lacked the will to stop him. By the mid-1930s, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, absorbed Austria, and demanded territory from Czechoslovakia. Each move, he followed a pattern: pressure, threat, negotiation, victory without war. Every success reinforced Hitler's confidence in his instincts. He had gambled,
and the world had stepped aside. Internally, this success reshaped decision-making. Military professionals who urged caution were increasingly ignored. Hitler trusted outcomes, not advice. The line between political maneuver and military action blurred. War became less a last resort and more a tool. By 1939, the system surrounding Hitler no longer functioned as a check. It functioned as an echo chamber. The belief that Germany could win quickly, decisively, dominated planning. Enemies were underestimated. Risks were dismissed. History, in Hitler's view, favored boldness. But beneath the surface of confidence, contradictions remained. Germany's economy was strained by rearmament. Resources were finite. The military was powerful, but not prepared for prolonged global war. Speed had become a necessity, not just a preference. This tension between ambition and reality would shape everything that followed. And as Europe edged closer to catastrophe, the stage was set not for a sudden explosion, but for a series of decisions that would redefine war itself. The deeper context behind those decisions reveals why early success made later failure inevitable. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Hitler's understanding of war had already been shaped by a dangerous pattern. Every major risk he had taken so far had succeeded. Each victory without serious resistance hardened a belief that would become central to his leadership, that intuition mattered more than caution, and will mattered more than material limits. The early campaigns of the war seemed to confirm this belief. Poland collapsed in weeks. Denmark and Norway followed. Then, in the spring of 1940, German forces moved west. France, the power that had dominated European strategy since 1918, fell in a matter of weeks. The speed stunned the world. Even Germany's own generals had not expected such a result. For Hitler, this was not simply a military success, it was personal validation. The method mattered less to him than the outcome. Blitzkrieg, though later mythologized as a carefully planned doctrine, was in practice a combination of speed, improvisation, and risk. German forces pushed forward aggressively, exploiting confusion rather than destroying enemy armies outright. The gamble worked because opponents were unprepared for the pace, not because Germany possessed unlimited strength. This distinction was critical and often ignored. Inside Germany's leadership structure, the balance shifted further. Traditional command chains weakened. Officers who questioned decisions were sidelined. Those who aligned with Hitler's worldview advanced. The war was no longer being fought solely by professional consensus. It was being driven by ideological momentum. At the same time, Hitler's view of his enemies grew distorted. Britain's refusal to surrender after France's defeat was not seen as resilience, but as denial. The Battle of Britain became a turning point, not because Germany lacked aircraft, but because Hitler misjudged resolve. He assumed pressure alone would break resistance. When it did not, frustration replaced strategy. This pattern repeated. Hitler increasingly viewed war as a test of endurance rather than coordination. He believed that enemies would collapse under sustained shock, just as France had. Long-term logistics, industrial depth, and resource management were treated as secondary concerns. The war had to be decided quickly because Germany could not afford for it to last. This urgency influenced the most consequential decision of all. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The scale was unprecedented. Millions of soldiers crossed a frontier stretching thousands of kilometers. The campaign was framed as both a military operation and an ideological crusade. The assumption was simple and fatal. The Soviet state would collapse under pressure, just as others had. But the Soviet Union was not France. Distance swallowed momentum. Supply lines stretched thin. Weather turned against the attackers. Resistance hardened instead of breaking. The war transformed from movement into attrition, the very scenario Germany was least prepared to sustain. As setbacks mounted, Hitler's leadership style changed further. Where he had once encouraged initiative, he now demanded obedience. Retreat was forbidden. Flexibility disappeared. Orders became absolute, even when conditions made them impossible to execute. Decision-making narrowed. Hitler involved himself in tactical details far below his level of command. Maps replaced reality. Reports were filtered to match expectations. The system no longer corrected errors, it concealed them. Losses were rationalized. Warnings were dismissed. Faith replaced assessment. Meanwhile, Germany's enemies adapted. The Soviet Union mobilized
its industry beyond the reach of German bombers. Britain rebuilt its strength. The United States entered the war, transforming the conflict into one of overwhelming production and manpower. The war Hitler had intended to control became something no individual could manage. Yet even as the strategic situation deteriorated, Hitler's belief in decisive reversal remained. New weapons, new offensives, new gambles, all promised salvation just beyond reach. Each failure reinforced a deeper commitment to the same approach. By the time defeat became unavoidable, the structure surrounding Hitler could no longer respond. It could only obey. This context of early success, misinterpreted lessons, and rigid belief explains why the war unfolded as it did, not as a sudden collapse of reason, but as a slow narrowing of options, driven by confidence turned into denial. To fully understand this transformation, the story must be examined from multiple perspectives, not just strategic, but human, technological, and moral. Because the truth of World War II does not exist in a single narrative, but in the angles through which it was experienced. The first angle is human, because every war is ultimately carried by individuals long before it is measured in maps and arrows. For the German soldier, Hitler was not initially a distant figure issuing abstract orders. He was a symbol of restored pride, of movement, of meaning after years of national humiliation. Many soldiers entered the war believing they were participating in the rebirth of their country, not the destruction of Europe. Early victories reinforced this belief. Campaigns were fast, decisive, and often appeared clean in contrast to the grinding stalemate remembered from the First World War. Soldiers marched through capitals, not trenches. The sense of invincibility was not imposed from above, it grew organically from experience. That confidence would later become a liability because it masked the cost of underestimating the enemy. The second angle is leadership. And here, the difference between image and reality becomes sharper. Hitler is often remembered as an irrational dictator issuing wild orders from isolation. In the early years of the war, however, his leadership was more complex. He listened selectively. He absorbed information that confirmed his instincts and rejected information that contradicted them. This was not madness, it was confirmation bias elevated to policy. Where professional generals evaluated probability, Hitler evaluated belief. When these aligned, decisions could appear bold and brilliant. When they diverged, reality was forced to bend until it broke. The structure of command gradually adjusted to this dynamic. Officers learned which reports were welcomed and which were not. The flow of truth narrowed, not because people lied deliberately, but because survival within the system required agreement. The third angle is technological. Germany entered the war with
aggressive weapons, but its true advantage lay in integration. Radios and tanks, coordination between air and ground forces, rapid decision cycles. These created speed. But speed has a cost. It consumes fuel, equipment, and men at a rate that demands constant success. Once momentum slowed, the same systems that delivered early victory struggled to sustain prolonged conflict. Technology also became a promise. As conditions worsened, Hitler increasingly placed faith in future weapons, aircraft, rockets, armored vehicles that could restore dominance. This belief postponed strategic adjustment. Rather than accepting limits, leadership waited for solutions that were always just out of reach. The fourth angle is the enemy perspective. Germany's opponents did not defeat Hitler by matching his early methods. They adapted. Britain learned to absorb pressure without collapse. The Soviet Union learned to trade space for time. The United States learned to convert industry into overwhelming force.
Each enemy responded differently, but all exploited the same weakness: Germany's dependence on rapid victory. The fifth angle is moral, and it is inseparable from policy. Hitler's war was not simply about territory or power, it was shaped by ideology. Entire populations were classified as obstacles rather than people. This mindset affected military decisions as much as political ones. Resources were diverted from the battlefield to enforce ideological goals. Brutality became routine. Resistance hardened instead of fading. This moral collapse was not a side effect, it was structural. It alienated potential allies, strengthened enemy resolve, and consumed energy that could not be replaced. War became total not only in scale, but in consequence. Each of these angles reveals a different truth. None alone explains the war. Together, they show how early effectiveness evolved into rigidity and how belief replaced adaptability. But to see how these forces collided at their most decisive,
A moment, the focus must shift from structure to pressure, to the moments when decisions could no longer be delayed and consequences could no longer be avoided. Those moments did not arrive suddenly. They built, day by day, until the war reached a point where reversal was no longer possible. And it is there, at the edge between choice and inevitability, that the next angle emerges. Another angle is strategic rigidity, and this is where the distance between Hitler and reality widened into something fatal. War demands adaptation. Conditions change, enemies learn, terrain punishes assumptions. Yet, as the conflict deepened, Hitler's tolerance for adjustment shrank. What had once been flexibility hardened into certainty. Plans were no longer hypotheses to be tested. They became expressions of will. This rigidity was most visible in the refusal to retreat. In earlier campaigns, German commanders had relied on controlled withdrawals to preserve strength and regain initiative. Under
Hitler's direct control, retreat became synonymous with weakness. Orders increasingly demanded that positions be held at all costs, regardless of tactical reality. Units were left encircled, not because escape was impossible, but because permission was denied. The consequences were cumulative. Entire formations were lost, not in battle, but in obedience. Another angle is time, how Hitler understood it and how he misunderstood it. Early success taught him that time favored the bold. Delay meant missed opportunity. Action meant advantage. This logic held when Germany faced opponents who were unprepared or hesitant. It collapsed once the war became global. Germany did not have the luxury of time. Its economy was not designed for long-term total war. It lacked access to key resources. Its industrial base was impressive but finite. Hitler's answer was acceleration. When confronted with obstacles, he pushed harder rather than pausing to reassess. Each escalation reduced future options.
Sense of urgency fed into operational decisions. Offensives were launched before forces were fully prepared. Winter campaigns ignored logistical warnings. Strategic reserves were committed prematurely. Success became necessary not to win, but to survive. Then there is the angle of perception, how Hitler saw himself. Victory transformed his self-image. He began to view intuition as destiny, success as proof of historical mission. Failure, when it occurred, was blamed on others, generals, weather, betrayal, insufficient loyalty. Responsibility narrowed upward only in triumph, never in error. This self-concept reshaped leadership dynamics. Those who reinforced the image were promoted. Those who challenged it were removed. Decision-making became insulated from contradiction. The system rewarded confidence over accuracy. Another angle lies in the relationship between ideology and military logic. Hitler's worldview framed the war as existential. Compromise was not just undesirable, it
Was impossible. This eliminated diplomatic flexibility. Peace was acceptable only as total victory. Negotiation became surrender. As the strategic situation worsened, the inability to imagine a negotiated end guaranteed prolonged destruction. Ideology also distorted target selection. Military objectives were sometimes subordinated to symbolic or ideological ones.
Resources flowed towards enforcement, repression, and spectacle, even as frontline units lacked support. These choices did not weaken resistance, they intensified it. Finally, there is the angle of isolation. As defeat approached, Hitler became increasingly detached from the physical reality of the war. Maps replaced terrain. Reports replaced experience. Decisions were made based on abstractions. The human cost, measured in exhausted soldiers, destroyed cities, and civilian suffering, became background noise. Isolation did not mean ignorance, it meant selective attention. Information that aligned with expectation was
liberated. Information that contradicted it was dismissed. The war was no longer something unfolding, it was something being insisted upon. Each of these angles converges on the same point. Hitler's greatest strength early in the war, belief in decisive action, became his greatest weakness when conditions demanded restraint, adjustment, and acceptance of limits. The transition from advantage to collapse did not occur in a single battle or decision. It occurred in a sequence of moments when alternatives existed but were rejected. Those moments would accumulate until one turning point forced reality to assert itself, regardless of belief. That turning point was not symbolic. It was physical, brutal, and irreversible. And when it arrived, the war entered a phase from which it would never recover. The turning point did not arrive with a single explosion or a sudden declaration. It arrived in fragments, across vast distances, under different skies, at different moments, all tied to
either by the same assumption that force of will could override material reality. In the summer of 1942, Germany launched what was intended to be a decisive campaign in the East. The objective was clear, at least on paper: secure the oil fields of the Caucasus, break the Soviet Union's ability to sustain war, deliver the blow that would end resistance permanently. The city of Stalingrad was not initially the main target. Its value was symbolic as much as strategic: a name, a river, a junction of supply routes. Yet symbolism mattered deeply to Hitler. It transformed objectives. What could have been bypassed became essential. What could have been flexible became fixed. As German forces advanced, early signs mirrored past successes: rapid movement, encirclements, Soviet units collapsing under pressure. Confidence returned, but beneath that momentum, the structure was fragile. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, fuel shortages appeared, reinforcements lagged behind. Warnings, they were ignored. By autumn, the battle for Stalingrad had become something entirely different. The city was reduced to ruins, not cleared. Streets became killing zones. Buildings changed hands multiple times a day. The advantages of mobility vanished. The fight became one of attrition. Close, personal, exhausting. This was precisely the type of battle Germany could least afford. Yet withdrawal was forbidden. Hitler ordered the city taken and held. The Sixth Army remained, locked into combat, consuming resources at a rate that could not be sustained. As winter approached, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Cold hardened the ground. Equipment failed. Morale declined. The Soviet response was deliberate. Rather than rushing to relieve the city, Soviet commanders waited. They built strength quietly. They massed forces beyond the German flanks, positions held by weaker Allied units. When the counteroffensive came in November 1942, it struck not at the city itself,
but at the vulnerable edges. Encirclement followed. Within days, the Sixth Army was surrounded. Over 250,000 men were trapped. Escape was possible early on. Generals requested permission to break out while strength remained. The request reached Hitler. He refused. Belief replaced calculation. He insisted that the army could be supplied by air, that relief would arrive, that holding position was a matter of honor and resolve. Reality offered no support for these assumptions.
The Luftwaffe lacked capacity. Weather grounded aircraft. Losses mounted. Inside the pocket, conditions collapsed. Ammunition ran low. Food became scarce. Wounded soldiers froze. Command structure fragmented under strain. The idea of victory dissolved into the struggle to survive. By January 1943, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Sixth Army surrendered in stages. It was the first complete destruction of a German field army. The psychological impact was enormous. The myth of invincibility shattered. But
Stalingrad was not an isolated failure. It exposed a pattern. Around the same time, in North Africa, German and Italian forces faced mounting pressure. Supply lines were vulnerable. Allied control of the sea limited reinforcement. Despite tactical skill, strategic position weakened steadily. Again, retreat was delayed. Again, resources were lost. Across the Atlantic, the United States accelerated production. Aircraft, tanks, ships, numbers grew beyond anything Germany could match. Time, once seen as an enemy, now favored the opposition. Stalingrad marked the moment when belief could no longer conceal imbalance. The war did not end there. Germany would fight on for more than 2 years. But the character of the conflict changed. Initiative shifted. Decisions became reactive. The possibility of decisive victory vanished. What followed was not sudden collapse, but prolonged erosion. Yet even after this turning point, Hitler did not abandon the logic that had brought him here. Instead,
He doubled down, seeking reversal through concentration, surprise, and technological promise. The next phase of the war would test whether a collapsing position could be salvaged through force of will alone. It would fail, and the cost of that failure would be measured not just in lost territory, but in the final destruction of everything the regime had claimed to defend. After Stalingrad, the war entered a phase defined less by opportunity than by resistance to inevitability. Germany no longer possessed strategic initiative across the conflict as a whole. Yet Hitler refused to accept the implications of that shift. In his view, defeat was not a condition created by material imbalance, but by insufficient resolve. This belief shaped the next major gamble. In the summer of 1943, German forces launched an offensive near the city of Kursk. It was intended to restore momentum in the east by destroying Soviet armored strength in a single, decisive blow. The plan relied on concentration of force, new weapons, and surprise, the same principles that had delivered earlier success. But the context had changed. Soviet intelligence had identified the buildup months in advance. Defensive lines were constructed in depth, minefields, trenches, anti-tank positions layered across kilometers. Reserves were positioned deliberately. The battlefield was prepared not for movement, but for absorption. When the German attack began in July, progress was slow and costly. Tanks advanced into prepared kill zones. Casualties mounted. The new weapons, while powerful, were mechanically unreliable and difficult to maintain. Air superiority was contested. Momentum never materialized. Within days, the offensive stalled. At the same time, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The Mediterranean theater demanded attention. Resources were divided. Strategic focus fractured. The war was no longer being fought on chosen ground, but on ground imposed by the enemy. Hitler faced a choice: commit further forces to Kursk in hopes of eventual breakthrough, or disengage to address threats elsewhere. He chose neither decisively. The offensive was halted without achieving its objective. Losses were irreplaceable. Soviet counterattacks followed almost immediately. From this point onward, Germany remained largely on the defensive in the east. This pattern repeated in the west. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Deception measures had misled German command about the location and timing. Critical reserves were held back due to uncertainty and centralized control. When reality became clear, reaction was delayed. Again, rigidity replaced responsiveness. German units fought with determination, but without the strategic freedom to maneuver effectively.
Air superiority belonged to the Allies. Supply routes were vulnerable. Attrition favored those with greater resources. Hitler responded not by adapting strategy, but by narrowing.
Gutted. Counterattacks were ordered where conditions did not support success. Defeat was framed as betrayal rather than miscalculation. The war became defensive not only militarily, but psychologically. As territory was lost, faith was transferred to future solutions. New aircraft, new rockets, new offensives. Each promised reversal. None addressed the fundamental imbalance. Technology could not compensate for exhaustion, isolation, and industrial inferiority. By late 1944, Germany's position was no longer salvageable. The Ardennes offensive, launched in December, was a final attempt to regain initiative in the West. It achieved temporary surprise. It failed to achieve strategic effect. Fuel shortages crippled progress. Weather delayed air operations only briefly. Once skies cleared, the offensive collapsed. What remained was endurance. Cities were bombed systematically. Infrastructure disintegrated. Civilian suffering increased. Front lines closed in from all directions. Yet
surrender remained unacceptable. Negotiation remained impossible. The war continued because stopping contradicted the identity of the regime itself. Inside leadership circles, options vanished. Loyalty was enforced. Reality was filtered. The space for dissent disappeared entirely. Orders demanded sacrifice without offering purpose. By early 1945, the conflict had compressed inward. Germany fought not for victory, but for delay. Every day gained was another day the system continued to exist. The final battles would not decide the outcome. They would only define the manner of the end. And as armies closed in on Berlin, the last phase of the war revealed what years of rigidity, belief, and refusal had produced. Not a dramatic reversal, but total collapse. When the fighting finally slowed, what remained was not clarity, but scale. The war that Hitler had shaped through belief and rigidity ended with a level of destruction that defied comparison. Entire regions lay in ruins. Cities were
reduced to skeletal outlines. Transportation networks were shattered. Industrial centers no longer functioned. The physical landscape of Europe bore scars that would take generations to erase. Militarily, the outcome was absolute. Germany was defeated on every front. Its armed forces were disbanded. Command structures dissolved. Millions of soldiers were killed, captured, or displaced. The losses were not merely numerical. They represented the collapse of an entire system built on speed, confidence, and centralized will. Politically, the regime ceased to exist. Adolf Hitler's death in April 1945 removed the symbolic center of authority, but it did not immediately restore coherence. What followed was fragmentation. Local commanders surrendered independently. Orders lost meaning. The state that had demanded absolute obedience disintegrated without a unifying force to replace it. The human cost extended far beyond the battlefield. Civilians constituted a significant portion of the dead.
Bombing campaigns had destroyed housing, hospitals, and infrastructure. Hunger and disease spread rapidly in the war's final months. Displacement became one of the defining experiences of the aftermath. Millions moved across borders that were no longer stable, carrying loss rather than possessions. Revelations followed quickly. As Allied forces advanced, they encountered evidence of crimes that had been concealed or minimized during the war. Camps, documents, and survivor testimony revealed the extent to which ideology had shaped policy. These discoveries reframed the conflict. The war was no longer understood solely as a struggle between states, but as a warning about the consequences of unchecked power and dehumanization. Strategically, the war transformed global balance. Europe emerged weakened, divided, and dependent on reconstruction. Two new centers of power dominated the post-war world: The conflict that Hitler had sought to win quickly had instead accelerated the decline of additional empires and reshaped international relations permanently. Psychologically, the aftermath was marked by exhaustion rather than triumph. Victory did not erase trauma. Defeat did not resolve guilt. Survivors faced a future defined by rebuilding rather than celebration. The war's end brought relief, but not closure. In Germany, reckoning began unevenly. Some denied responsibility, others confronted it directly. Institutions were dismantled and rebuilt. Memory became contested ground. The image of Hitler shifted from leader to cautionary figure, not immediately, but gradually, as evidence accumulated and distance allowed reflection. What emerged from the aftermath was not a single lesson, but a convergence of consequences. Early decisions echoed through final outcomes. Systems built on certainty collapsed when reality refused to conform. The refusal to adapt did not preserve strength, it magnified loss. Yet the full meaning of this aftermath cannot be understood without aiming how history absorbed it, how judgment, accountability, and memory shaped what followed. Because the war did not truly end in 1945. Its consequences continued to unfold in courts, in policy, and in the collective understanding of what had happened, and why. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, the war shifted from the battlefield to the courtroom and the archive. Responsibility, long diffused by bureaucracy and obedience, was confronted directly. The Nuremberg trials did not attempt to explain the war as an accident of history. They framed it as a sequence of choices made by individuals within a system that rewarded loyalty over restraint. This distinction mattered. For the first time, aggression itself was treated as a crime. Planning and initiating war was no longer viewed as a political act beyond judgment. It became subject to law. Documents, orders, and testimony exposed how ideology had been translated into policy, and how policy had been enforced through administrative efficiency as much as violence. The trials did not bring universal closure. Many perpetrators escaped justice. Many victims never saw accountability. But the process established a record, one that removed ambiguity. The war could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding or inevitability. Its causes and conduct were documented in detail. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape hardened. Former allies became rivals. The destruction of Europe created a vacuum filled by competing visions of order. Reconstruction was not only about rebuilding cities, but about defining alignment. Economic aid, political systems, and military alliances shaped the post-war world. The conflict that Hitler had accelerated became the foundation of a new global tension, one defined less by open battle than by ideological standoff. Nuclear weapons replaced mass armies as the ultimate measure of power. The speed that once defined blitzkrieg gave way to deterrence and balance. Within Germany, the process of reconstruction required confronting memory. Physical rebuilding was faster than moral reckoning. Narratives competed. Some emphasized suffering, others emphasized responsibility. Over time, institutions evolved to support reflection rather than denial. Education, memorials, and public discourse gradually reshaped understanding. This process was uneven and incomplete, but it mattered. It demonstrated that collapse did not have to lead to repetition, that history, when examined honestly, could function as restraint rather than inspiration. Internationally, the war altered assumptions about leadership. Charisma without accountability was no longer admired unquestioningly. Centralized authority without institutional balance became suspect. The idea that will alone could substitute for planning was exposed as dangerous. Yet perhaps the most enduring aftermath was psychological. The belief that modern society had outgrown total war was destroyed. Industrial capability, ideological certainty, and bureaucratic efficiency were revealed as tools that could magnify destruction rather than prevent it. The war ended illusions as much as it ended regimes.
And still, decades later, the figure of Hitler remains central, not because of uniqueness, but because of representativeness. He embodied how systems fail when power is insulated, when belief replaces evidence, and when dissent is framed as weakness. Understanding this aftermath is not about assigning blame alone. It is about recognizing patterns, how early success can distort judgment, how rigidity can masquerade as strength, and how refusal to adapt accelerates collapse. Those patterns do not belong only to the past. They persist wherever authority goes unchallenged, and certainty becomes policy. Which is why the final meaning of this war does not rest in dates or battles alone, but in the questions it leaves behind. Questions that demand reflection. History often simplifies World War II into simple
Flags raised, cities liberated, leaders defeated. But beneath those images lies a quieter truth, one that is less comfortable and far more important. The war was not driven forward by chaos alone. It was shaped by structure, by belief, and by the steady removal of limits. Adolf Hitler did not lose the war because he lacked intelligence or resolve. He lost it because success taught the wrong lessons. Early victories rewarded speed over sustainability, belief over balance, and obedience over correction. What worked once was applied everywhere. What failed was never questioned long enough to be changed. This is the unsettling truth behind World War II. Systems collapsed not at the moment of defeat, but at the moment they stopped listening. When disagreement became disloyalty and adjustment became weakness, reality had only one way left to assert itself: through destruction. The war also revealed how modern power multiplies consequences. Industrial capacity, ideology, and organization transformed individual decisions into continental outcomes. A single order could move armies. A single belief could justify policy. Humanity did not fail because it was primitive, but because it was efficient. And yet, within this collapse, something else emerged. The aftermath forced the world to confront responsibility in a way it never had before. Aggression was named. Obedience was questioned. Authority was no longer beyond judgment. These changes did not erase suffering, but they altered the framework in which future decisions would be made. World War II did not end certainty. It exposed its danger. The figure of Hitler endures, not because he was uniquely monstrous, but because he represents what happens when power is insulated from restraint, when conviction replaces evidence, and when systems reward loyalty over truth. His story is not a warning about one man. It is a warning about how structures fail when they stop adapting. History does not repeat itself mechanically, but it echoes patterns. The real legacy of this war lies not in its battles, but in its lessons. Lessons written in ruins, records, and memory. Whether those lessons endure depends not on history itself, but on those who choose to remember it honestly. That choice remains unfinished.